Great. Thanks, Maddie. Today, we're going to be focusing on climate change communication. So we've done a lot of work thinking through all 5 steps of the adaptation workbook. And now what we really want to emphasize through this lecture today is how do you take all of that information and really tell an impactful story on what you're trying to do and how you're implementing your adaptation strategies for your local projects. And again, this training today is going to be led by Maddie and I, but you can reach out to any of us from the NIAX team with any questions you have as we're going along. And we're all great resources for checking in if you have any questions as you're wrapping up your adaptation workbook projects. So the agenda for today, we're really going to be talking about wrapping up this course, which is very exciting, communicating about climate change, how are impactful ways you can tell your adaptation story, and then the last little bit of homework before our last session next week. So congratulations to all of you. You've done it. You've made it through all 5 steps of the adaptation workbook at this point. And so it's a ton of work, and we're really excited that you've made it with us this far. And of course, there's still some things we're wrapping up and things you may want to tweak, but you should really celebrate all of the work that you've done on your real world adaptation projects to this point. It's been a huge lift for all of you, and we really, really appreciate your time and investment in this training. So when we began the course, we really talked about the 5 steps of the adaptation workbook, but what it really can boil down to are these 2 questions of how might climate change affect the resources that I manage, and what management actions can help prepare for those different effects. And so at the beginning, before the course started, there were lots of questions, and many people were kind of unsure about where do we start? What does climate change mean for me? What are those local impacts going to be, and what can I expect? And how do I respond to climate change? And the answer to most of these questions, as you've learned, is that it depends. There aren't simple questions, and there's no single answer for how to respond to climate change because the different variables are so complex. And so it comes back to the place you're working in, its characteristics, and your goals for your project areas. And so we've covered a lot of information from thinking about your place to those climate impacts to how you want to adapt through your actions. And now, hopefully, at the end of the course, you've got this. So we're hoping you feel better equipped to answer these big overarching questions about climate change effects and how you can adapt through your actions to really start to identify and implement your adaptation plans. We also have evidence of your progress throughout this course. So this is part of why we ask those homework questions. At the start of the workbook, we were curious how you felt about being able to identify viable climate change adaptation strategies, and that can be applied to your local areas. And a little more than half of you felt that you could, but now most of you have indicated that you feel like you can identify those different climate change adaptation strategies for your local projects. And the same thing with being able to translate those broad adaptation concepts and strategies to actionable adaptation tactics for your local area. So it's great to see this increase in really your comfort levels with how to think about the adaptation actions and strategies. And now that you've all developed your climate adaptation plans, you can also download them from the adaptation workbook and use them to reference in the future. So hopefully these will be helpful for informing other management plans you may have or additional documents you might be working on, and really use these as reference points for thinking about those climate impacts you researched and those adaptation actions and strategies that you've selected. And it also provides you with some of the science and the research for those climate change impacts through that long reference list from the National Climate Assessments and the vulnerability assessments, and how to translate that into your decisions behind your actionable adaptation tactics. So definitely be sure to download and export your plans once you've completed all of the steps in the adaptation workbook. And then just to remind you of the purpose of this course, we were really hoping that you would be able to practice adaptation using the adaptation workbook process. So now that you've gone through this, We're hoping that this process is now something familiar to you and that you can use for other projects moving forward as well. So you know how this process works, you know what the 5 steps are, and it's a tool and a resource to come back to again when you have another plan that you really want to intentionally consider those climate change considerations as a part of. It's also a chance for you to bring in your local expertise and your knowledge to really apply these tools to your project area and document your thought process from your goals and your objectives for your place within the context of how much risk are you willing to tolerate and what do you value about these locations that you manage or work or live within. We're also documenting your intent. So we've created this thought process through these adaptation workbook plans that really show what you were thinking, why you want to try these different adaptation strategies and actions, what are some of those benefits and drawbacks and barriers. And so future managers will hopefully know what you were thinking, and you have this thought process of connecting the dots from your values to what you're implementing on the ground. And then finally, throughout this whole process, we've really been trying to create this community of practice. So even though we're meeting virtually, you've had a chance to talk with others who are working on similar projects or from similar regions in the breakout group discussions, make connections with each other, learn from each other, and help us improve this tool. So thank you all so much for joining this team of practitioners really thinking about climate change adaptation. And we hope you'll continue to work with each other and connect with each other and share your ideas and successes. So in terms of wrapping things up, again, today we're really going to be talking about climate change communication, some instructions for finishing up your work in the adaptation workbook, and how to share your adaptation story. And then we'll dive into our discussion session this week as well. So don't forget that we do have one last discussion session where we'll talk about adaptation and monitoring and climate communication. So with that, we're going to switch gears and really dive into effective climate change communication. So I'm going to start with some tips and tricks about knowing your audience and then hand it off to Maddie, who's really going to talk about different strategies for reaching your different audiences. So it's one thing to communicate the hows and whys of your plan, but bringing climate change into the mix really adds another layer to navigate when communicating effectively about climate change communication and adaptation. And as professionals, we're increasingly expected to integrate climate change into our plans and documents and activities. And there's a strong need to both understand and effectively communicate to diverse audiences when it comes to climate change information. And so this is really a way for us to think about how do we reach those different audiences? How do we effectively communicate about climate change impacts and why we're implementing the different adaptation actions that we are, and how do we connect with our audience's values and where they're working at to really tell an impactful story. So it all comes down to really knowing and being able to connect with your audience. So the more you know about your audience, the better we're able to support and empower and help them make those changes and walk away with those tangible solutions and actions that benefit both them, their place, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. So one great tool that is an awesome resource to keep in your back pockets is the Yale Climate Change Opinion Maps. And so these are really a way for us to think about, what do the majority of Americans think about climate change? What are their perceptions and their beliefs and their risk values, their political opinions, and some of their thoughts about behaviors when it comes to climate change adaptation and mitigation? And so Yale has basically grouped people into these 6 Americas. And you can see that the majority of them fall on the end of having the highest belief that global warming is occurring, and they are alarmed or concerned or cautious about it. So the majority, again, of people think it's happening across America. And then so we can have information about what are those different groups, those 6 Americas, how do we reach them, some tips and tricks from that Yale climate change study. But then they also create these awesome visualization maps. And so you can see averages across America, and you can also dive into your state or your county and see what some of those different climate change opinions are using this visual map data. And so the darker the red is, the more people believe that climate change is occurring or happening. There we go. So the other thing that I think is really fascinating is that you can really, again, compare and contrast some of these different beliefs that the Yale climate change study has asked. But you can see on the left, the majority, again, of people think that climate change is happening. But then it's a different story when we start to think about the percent of adults who believe most scientists think global warming is happening. And so you can see that shift from those dark red colors of consensus around it's happening to a little bit more blue, where people disagree that scientists think global warming is happening. So for me, that really is telling us the story that as managers and practitioners and climate scientists, we really need to be doing a better job of communicating climate change impacts and how we're responding to it, because that's not coming across with the people and the audiences that we work with. So there's a gap in our climate change communication that we really need to start to address. The other cool thing, as I mentioned about this tool, is you can dive in to really local results. So if you're really interested in knowing what are the climate perceptions of my state, or what are the climate perceptions of my county, you can really delve into those local considerations and get to know a little bit more about the audiences within your particular county as you're thinking about climate communication. So this is an example from Houghton County in Michigan. So you can really compare those averages to the national averages, your state average, and your county average as well. The Yale research provides a great snapshot. However, it's important for us to really think about the different communities that we're working with, and we can really start to see some different stories come out as well. And so this is a study that was done from the University of Michigan on forest landowners and their perceptions of climate change. And so the green is showing disagreement with these statements, and the blue is showing agreement with these statements. And so you can really see for forest landowners, they think that climate change is happening. They think it's human activities are contributing to that change. They especially think that forests play a role in the climate and that forest management can affect climate change. And so knowing what those particular forest landowners think can also be helpful for us as we're working with them to come up with their particular management plans and specifically address climate considerations. There's also been research done on perceptions of foresters in Canada. And so this is showing, again, that the majority of foresters believe that climate change is currently having a significant impact on forest ecosystems in Canada and will continue to do so over the next 50 and 100 years. They also think, as a majority, 74%, that we need to create and design new forest practices to deal with the impacts of climate change on our forests. And that you can see that there's this connection, and foresters who are connected to the land, working in the forests, are noticing those impacts. And so they're able to observe those changes over time. And so those perceptions are reflecting that experience on the ground as well. So all of this is to say, it's really important to know who our audiences are and really be able to connect and engage with their values. So we can really start by thinking about, what do our communities care about? What do they value about these places we're living and recreating and working within? If people are especially concerned about wildlife, maybe we can start to talk about those climate change impacts on migrating birds, or how longer growing seasons may increase deer populations and intensify browsing pressures on some of our different tree and plant species. Or if we know our audience loves winter sports, we can really talk about how climate change may be reducing opportunities for things like skiing and snowmobiling and ice fishing from those shorter winters, earlier springs, and less snowpack. So really knowing what our audiences value and being able to tailor our communication to those local values and impacts is going to be especially important. So again, we really want to think about what our audience is valuing and really how that is going to influence each of our different communication opportunities, especially with those private landowners. And then finally, it's really important that we don't forget about social justice and climate justice considerations as we're telling our communication stories as well. So we know that a changing climate deepens injustice and amplifies inequities. And it's important that we don't overlook some of these root issues that are then exacerbated by these climate change impacts. And so we can really think about some of those stressors and challenges due to longstanding issues related to inequities are going to be exacerbated and amplified by climate change impacts to these communities. So in our storytelling, we can really highlight those opportunities for addressing some of these different inequities and be transparent about the ways we may or may not be addressing them directly in our work. And so we can really talk about that holistic story of what's happened in the past, what's going on now, and what are some of those future opportunities for climate adaptation that also address some of these justice concerns. And there's awesome resources that are coming out now, such as the Justice 40 initiative, that we can reference and bring into our climate change stories and really help us tell some of those more impactful connections and relationships to people in place. And so Maddie's and I are gonna bring up some of those different tools and resources that we can reference later on in this presentation as well. So with that, I'm gonna stop and hand it over to Maddie.
All right, thank you, Courtney. Can you see that? Cool. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk now about how to connect with your audience and some more principles on how to most effectively present climate change information and stories. And so I imagine the kind of general term audience means something somewhat different for everyone here today, given the different organizations you represent and roles that you're in. But as we move through this, I just encourage you to consider an audience that you may already have and connect with regularly, as well as other audiences you may be interested in or see value in engaging with, but don't currently. So you can kind of apply these principles to those two lines of thought. So one key way to connect with your audience's values is, of course, to simply show up and listen. However you're able to do that, whether it's through in-person participation at different events or in-person or online meetings, reading different people's writing, or maybe looking into survey results. There's just a lot of ways to potentially connect with your audience and get a sense of their values. And this really becomes the foundation for a good relationship. So the more you can build a good relationship with your audience, the easier it is to have substantive discussions about climate change. People may also have really valuable insights to offer you related to a particular place that can help inform your climate management. And those are experiences that are sometimes cultivated over a decade-long experience with particular lands or traditional knowledge handed down across generations, or just working and connecting really closely to an area. So the more time that you invest in this exchange with your audience, the more beneficial it really is to all parties. And it's really crucial to avoid fear, blame, and shame in your communication. So we all know climate change is a really overwhelming topic. It can be a pretty difficult thing to talk about, but approaching it in a way where you acknowledge some of that grief and some of those more difficult feelings, but then really shift into focusing on shared goals and outcomes can help break down those isolated, powerless feelings that people have and shift instead into building empowerment and inspiring action. So in your roles as various different land managers and professionals, you're actually in a really powerful position to offer clarity, support, and opportunities for people to get involved with, or at least understand that there are tangible steps we can take to help ecosystems and our communities adapt to climate change. So the first big step in being able to communicate about climate change and inspire that action is to then tailor your message for your audience. So you want to ask yourself, who am I talking to? What might they know and what might they want to know? And what do they care about and value? So you're likely already going to be familiar with a lot of your local issues if your audience is somewhere that you already live and work. But regardless, spending some time researching local issues and learning about the concerns and values of different groups that you're communicating with will really go a long way. And so maybe there are some recent disturbances or climate trends that are most likely to be on the top of people's mind in a certain area. There could also be opportunities along the way for you to share knowledge that they're interested in and deliver information that they might have a need for. So the takeaway here is to really just do your homework to understand your audience, kind of make consistent contact and don't assume anything so that you can really tailor your messaging to have the greatest impact. Another good principle is to rely on trusted messengers. So those trusted messengers can be you and your colleagues, but we can also engage with health professionals, outdoor recreation organizations, faith networks, and trusted peers in the community that we work with. You might also partner with tribal nations, land trusts, watershed groups, local game chapters, professional organizations, or soil and water conservation districts to help you tap into a broader audience. Some voices we don't really want to rely on, or at least to be the main communicators about climate change, are politicians and the media. So climate change is obviously on many levels a political and politicized issue, but it's really those local voices and trusted messengers that can be the most effective at helping people understand and mobilize around climate change. So now let's talk a little bit about the essentials of developing an effective climate narrative to get through to your audience. So, of course, it's really important when we're communicating about climate change to be a credible messenger, which means relying upon unbiased scientific research. So there are many misconceptions about climate change and different voices chiming in all of the time on this topic. So you really want to make sure that you're turning to the most trusted and relevant sources of information. At the same time, you really want to focus on highlighting messages that are accessible to the general public. So for general audiences, you really want to try to minimize diving too deep into scientific research and really just stick to using model results and other scientific research as part of to ground your larger story and your storytelling. So highlighted here on this slide, we have 2 volumes of the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is a great resource for providing the best available science and research in a really accessible format, and also providing key takeaways and supporting evidence. So we'll share the links to that. And also a 5th National Climate Assessment should be coming out very soon. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. And then lastly, something that I think a lot of communications and outreach could benefit from is being clear about uncertainty. So if there's uncertainty in model results and potential climate impacts, that's something you're going to really want to communicate. In addition to sharing that full range of plausible futures, we can acknowledge what we do know through observed trends, data sets, and experiences, but also what we don't know and what gaps in understanding there might be. So we've said it many times throughout this training, there really is no crystal ball for us to know exactly how things are going to be playing out at a local level. And that's an important message for people to hear so that they don't necessarily fixate on one outcome and they understand that there's a lot of inherent complexity to this issue. So again, if our starting point is that unbiased scientific research, you're going to want to then break that down and make it relevant to your audience, which is really similar to what we asked you to do in steps 2 and 3 of the adaptation process, to take those regional climate trends and that research you did and then consider what the project site impacts would be for your site. So for instance, you may have this data from NOAA that shows February average temperatures are increasing by almost a ½ degree each decade. But what does that really mean, right? How would you break that down for your audience? So you can connect the dots between this data point and communicate with your audience that this could imply a warmer winter, earlier spring, and shifting plant hardiness zones, which could result in unfavorable growing conditions for certain native species, potential increase in drought due to a longer growing season, and greater pressure from invasive species and pests. So talking about these specific place-based changes can help your audience move from that distant concern and understanding of climate change to local action and ultimately support for your climate-informed management action. In that same vein, telling a local story and including visuals can also really help connect with an audience and bring things closer to home. So maybe the area that you're working in has experienced climate impacts before, such as a major flood or drought. Sharing what that looks like on the ground is going to really help you connect with them. So by referencing well-known events, you can facilitate discussion around the immediate and long-term effects of those events, how they were handled, and what could be done differently in the future to make sure that impacts are less severe should these events occur again. And so just another example to really drive that point home about connecting climate change to the issues that matter to your audience. Here's another example of presenting really direct and specific information. So instead of saying something like, your region will see an increase in extreme precipitation, you might communicate that within the next 20 years, you're expecting to see a 10 to 20% increase in 3-inch rain events, which could result in up to X% of soil loss. It could also maybe result in major flooding events that are more extreme to a previous event that you can reference and point to in the area. So again, just really taking those broader descriptions of regional climate impacts and bringing them down to a more specific, relatable level. Okay, so that was all about communicating climate change impacts, but now we're going to shift into piecing together the bigger picture and your adaptation story. So here is a general model for pulling together an adaptation story, starting with describing your place and purpose, highlighting key risks from climate change, describing adaptation actions to address those key risks, and ending with outcomes and benefits of those actions. So I imagine this looks really familiar to all of you because it's essentially the thought process that you've been going through with the adaptation workbook. So this is where we really get the chance to utilize positive and productive messaging and empower our audiences by focusing on solutions and benefits. So we really shouldn't use doom and gloom approach in any of our messaging because it can make people feel helpless and disengaged. But we really want to connect those dots between the climate impacts we're expecting and then actions that we are suggesting. So we want to highlight really tangible examples, ideas, and steps that audiences can either be a part of or support in other ways, such as the ones you see here. So in this first example, we are looking at how there's a shift from zone 5 to zone 6 in this area over the next 20 years. And they're highlighting an opportunity to plant certain species that might not have survived the winters previously. And in the second example, in response to intense precipitation events increasing, they're highlighting the opportunity to invest in green infrastructure for stormwater management. So you should always really take the chance to highlight the co-benefits of good management in your communications. because most climate change adaptation efforts are supporting our other efforts to manage ecosystems for long-term benefits, essential functions, and resilience under a range of future conditions. So you can connect your plans and intentions to existing conservation goals and actions that you know may already resonate with your audience, and really focus on highlighting how these goals and the actions taken to achieve them become even more important in a changing climate. And here are 2 examples highlighting how you can connect your actions to multiple beneficial outcomes where it makes sense to. So you really want to focus on emphasizing where there might be win-win opportunities to reduce the severity and risk of stressors and climate impacts over time. So maybe you want to increase species diversity in your area in order to reduce the impact of multiple threats like pests, disease, and warmer temperatures. Or maybe thinking about the local impacts of past severe weather events can inspire support to redesign infrastructure and facilities that can better cope with more severe future conditions. So this example on the right highlights the cost, cleanup, and safety benefits of moving sites to higher grounds. And you hopefully maybe are familiar with Mad Libs, but this is just a little tool we like to share for people to tell a brief and effective climate adaptation story. So this is a really helpful starting point for piecing together the components of your project into a short and straightforward narrative. So I'm just going to run through a couple of examples that kind of follow this model so that you can kind of see how concise and effective this approach can be. So one example of this narrative is from northern Minnesota along the Superior Hiking Trail. And planners there are predicting that climate change impacts are going to be exacerbating their problems related to erosion and more visitation overall, especially on busy weekends. So considering the impact of longer, wetter seasons, they want to take steps that will protect visitor safety and also the hiking trail. So here you can see a breakdown of how this statement includes the key components of a climate change story. So they have their place, their climate impacts, their adaptation actions, and their outcomes all highlighted. So they're considering a few different tactics related to recreation, redirecting visitors and creating alternative areas for hiking in order to, again, protect the safety of their visitors and reduce soil erosion. Another example here is from the state of New York at the Tug Hill Forest managed by the Nature Conservancy. And managers there are concerned about a general decline of their canopy species, given a variety of climate stressors, especially given some of the problems that they have with regeneration of certain species such as white pine, oaks, and hickories, which are ultimately species that they want to promote. And so here, again, you can see a breakdown of the place, climate impact, adaptation actions, and outcomes. And at Tug Hill, they're planning on guiding climate resilient species during span development and restoring the regeneration of climate adaptive species in order to increase the overall resilience of the forest to the impacts of climate change. So yeah, those are just 2 short examples of that kind of Mad Lib approach to these narratives. These examples didn't actually include co-benefits, but I'm sure you can imagine some of the ways these actions would support other goals related to things like recreation, water quality, wildlife, and other topics. So those co-benefits could definitely be woven into a narrative as well. Okay, so this is kind of just a takeaway slide to summarize everything we've gone over so far. So we have our do's and don'ts of climate change communication. So again, you really want to Tailor your information to a specific audience as opposed to presenting generic or overly technical information. You want to keep statistics and graphs and data to a minimum, and try to use relevant imagery as much as possible. You want to use local examples and as opposed to being abstract about threats. And of course, we don't want to focus on doom and gloom. We want to center the conversation around opportunities and actions and those benefits and solutions that you are doing the hard work of thinking about for your project. So hopefully that's all gotten you, gotten your wheels turning about telling your adaptation story, which is what we are going to all do for next week as we reach the end of the training. So ideally, pulling your story together is going to enable you to gather different kinds of support, be it institutional support, community support, or financial support, as well as enable you to reach a larger audience and communicate the key lessons that you're learning as you're integrating climate change considerations into your management. So if you're actively seeking out funding, this is also a really great exercise to help you prepare those key messages and plans in order to leverage resources and engage partners. So next week is going to be our last two sessions, and we're going to have time to hear from you all. So this is one of our favorite parts as a team, because we've all been split up in different discussion groups. And, you know, we share a little bit about your projects behind the scenes, but really we don't get that sense because we don't get to work with everyone. So yeah, this is a great chance for us and everybody else in the training to have the chance to hear your story. So you're each going to have the opportunity to share 5 minutes on your project, which is not a lot of time. So we really encourage you to simplify as much as possible. We're also going to be providing you a template of a short slide deck. And so you can stick to about like a minute to a minute and 15 seconds per slide. And you might be tempted to either share like every detail of your adaptation workbook, or maybe you're the opposite and you're tempted to keep it really brief. But if you could shoot for about that 5-minute mark, we've found that that's really the sweet spot for telling these stories. So yeah, I'm gonna share with you a template right now for you to work from. But really, we encourage you to be creative in sharing your story. And what your future vision is for your site and how climate adaptation is integrated into it. So this is slide 1 of the templates. We are going to email you these slides and also, include them in the follow-up newsletter. But essentially, your homework is to return them to us by May 8th. So that would be next Monday. And the first slide would really focuses on your place and purpose and sharing major management goals that relate to your project. So this really follows along with the adaptation workbook steps. And slide 2 is going to be outlining the top 2 to 4 climate impacts and management challenges that are most important for your story. And so here, it can be easy to maybe want to list all of them because I'm sure you're all dealing with a lot of different climate challenges. But again, just try to focus on the most important top 2 to 4 climate challenges for your site. And so you're gonna also use this slide to discuss your step 3 challenges and opportunities analysis and share, how climate change makes it harder or easier for you to achieve your management goals and objectives. Then slide 3 is going to be sharing your adaptation actions that you developed, and also kind of touching on what about these ideas is new or different from your business as usual management approach. So for the most part, I think we're not really familiar with each other's projects. So try to let us know how this is maybe a deviation from the baseline if you cite somewhere where there was already a lot of management going on or not much at all, and how these climate adaptation ideas fit into that bigger picture of management for you. And of course, there's room for pictures and maps. And lastly, you'll summarize intended outcomes. So what are some potential outcomes you hope to achieve through your project? And so, you know, you can kind of look way out with this, or you can just look a little bit further out from right now, but really re-reference your goals and objectives to kind of, help you think about the big picture here. And also take this slide as a chance to share any of those co-benefits. Great. So as you're putting that together, if you haven't already, you can check out some of these existing adaptation demonstration projects by visiting our portal at forestadaptation.org. These are all real-world examples of how managers have integrated climate considerations into their management planning and efforts. And we feature these stories on our website to really demonstrate that there's a huge variety of perspectives and approaches to climate adaptation being taken across the country, as well as groups representing a variety of different circumstances, ecosystem types, and ownerships. So all of these projects on this portal have used our adaptation process resources in various ways. So you'll definitely be very familiar with how the stories are laid out. And of course, this is totally optional, but we would love to add your project stories to our adaptation demonstration webpage to highlight your good work and be able to share it with others who may be working in your region or addressing similar topics and challenges. And of course, this also provides you with a link to easily circulate and highlight your story. So yeah, all the stories added here are publicly available, and there'll be a unique link associated with your page. So that could be helpful for just communication among your partners or highlighting and funding applications. And so there's no rush on doing this right away, but as we wrap up the training, this is something that we can assist you with if you're interested. So we can either share a simple document template with you that you'll fill out yourself, and you can provide a few photos to be highlighted on the page as well. Or you can request one of us to actually use your adaptation workbook answers to come up with a first draft, and then we would share that with you and kind of draft it together. So yeah, we can take one of those two approaches. And just to clarify too, even if you're in the early stages of your project or you're just in a planning phase, that's totally cool. Your project doesn't have to be done or even ongoing to be highlighted on the website. It's actually really beneficial to be able to share projects that are in different phases on this portal. So yeah. And I think I'm going to hand it back off to Courtney now to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie. So as we mentioned, again, there are tons and tons of climate communication resources out there. We've just compiled a few of them. So we really do encourage you to continue to explore and look for some of those different climate communication tools and resources and tips. These are just a couple. So one is from the IPCC showing 6 principles, especially for scientists, and some of the IPCC authors for use and public engagement, and principles for communicating with different publics, especially some of that really difficult climate science work done by some of our global climate scientists. There's also a great climate handbook for talking about climate change from the climateoutreach.org. So that's another resource to go to and really has some ideas and tips for how to have conversations about climate change in your daily life. And they have a report about that. And then the Land Trust Alliance also has some great tips and tricks for climate communication, especially with private landowners about how to talk about climate change. Next slide, please, Maddie. And then here are just a few more. One is the public lands curriculum, which we've shared in a couple of newsletters, but it's an educational resource that aims to tell a more authentic and complete story about our public lands and connect the dots for readers as to why people of color and economically disadvantaged communities often experience some of the worst effects of today's climate crisis, and how public lands can help be a solution to some of these threats. We also mentioned the Justice 40 initiative, so really thinking about making Justice 40 a reality for some of our frontline communities experiencing climate impacts. This is especially important for all of us who are receiving IRA and bill funding, because this is going to be key in how we get some of that funding to implement some of our adaptation projects. Eco America also has 15 steps to create effective climate communication that are really tangible and easy to download and use, including a lot of the tips that Maddie and I covered today for reaching your different audiences. And then there's also this great resource talking about conversations on the politics and science of climate change from the Buckeye State, from a collaborative partnership. And so that's a great YouTube video to check out if you're interested as well. Next slide, please, Maddie. And then one other group, if you're interested, is the Adaptation Society, or American Society of Adaptation Professionals. So if you're looking to continue having that community of practice with other adaptation practitioners, this is a great resource. And many of us at NIAX are a part of ASAP, or the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And they have a living guide to the principles of climate change adaptation, which is really helpful for thinking about engaging with professionals and talking about climate change adaptation and communicating climate change. Awesome. So looking ahead, again, please wrap up your adaptation workbook steps, download your plans, and complete that last homework assignment by next Monday. And so then what we're going to do is send you that PowerPoint template in our newsletter, and you can download it from the adaptation workbook and really have that opportunity to tell your story about all of the work and time and energy you've put into this training to really talk about your climate change adaptation projects for this course. And so there's also some optional readings for thinking about climate adaptation and resilience if you're interested, as well as some of those communicating climate change adaptation, those value-based communication strategies, if you want to dive into some of the research a little bit more. So we do have a link to the Google Drive where you can let us know what time you'd like to sign up for presenting. We have 4 different slots for you to sign up for. So thinking about Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. or Tuesday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern time, as well as Wednesday morning or Wednesday afternoon. So hopefully one of those 4 time slots will work for you if you would like to share your presentation and your adaptation story with others in this course. And everyone is welcome and invited to attend any of these sessions to hear the presentations from your peers. So Maddie, I believe, put the link, and you can go to that Google Drive, download the PowerPoint template, and sign up for a slot for when you're interested in presenting and sharing your story. And then also look for that URL. We'll be sure to send it again in the newsletter. And then don't forget, we do have a discussion session this week where we'll talk about adaptation tactics and monitoring. And this is just one more chance for you to learn from others, share what you're thinking about, and get some tips and tricks and new ideas about some of those different adaptation tactics and monitoring ideas. So again, if you're interested, please do share your story and give that 5-minute presentation next week. We'll have those 4 sessions that you can sign up for anytime that works for you, and feel free to attend any or all of the sessions that you would like to see other presentations. And that is it. That's what we've got for the adaptation planning and practices training. So thank you all so much for your time and your energy and your investment in this course. And we really hope that you do share your stories with us next week. And as always, if you have any follow-up questions or want any additional resources, reach out to any of us and we're happy to help and continue the conversation. Awesome. So with that,